The 21st century has seen no conflict quite like the Ukraine war, the largest war in Europe since World War II and the deadliest conflict of the 21st century. It completely reshaped geopolitics, global power dynamics, and our very lives. But what if that never happened? Now, before we dive into the alternate timeline, we need to discuss how the war could have been avoided. Also, just to be clear, by Ukraine war, I mean the 2022 invasion, not the annexation of Crimea and the Donbas conflict. To stop Russia from invading, we could just simply say that Putin decides the invasion is not worth it. But that's kinda boring, and also not the most realistic point of divergence. Instead, we'll change how the West reacted to Russian aggression before the invasion. So in this video, we'll first quickly cover how the West could have reacted and then explore an alternate world without the Ukraine war up until our present time in 2025. For Western deterrence to be successful, we need to travel back in time, but we actually don't need to travel that far. Sure, we could go back to 2014, but really, we just need the West to take the 2021 troop buildup more serious. Back in March of 2021, Russia started massing troops on the Ukrainian border. American intelligence monitored the situation tightly, and by November 2021, they were certain Russia plans to invade Ukraine. The Americans went public with the information and warned Western leaders. Unfortunately, nobody really believed Russia was about to invade. And that exactly is our divergence point. Western leaders believe US intelligence and are convinced Putin actually plans to invade. Macron doesn't call Putin on a daily basis to reason with him. Instead, European leaders meet in late November to discuss their options. In early December, European leaders, except the Russian asset Viktor Orban, jointly condemn the Russian troop buildup and issue a warning that any invasion will lead to heavy economic and political consequences. Shortly after, NATO holds a massive exercise in Poland while moving defensive equipment close to the Ukrainian border. And in December, Germany drops the hammer. Olaf Scholz announces the cancellation of Nord Stream 2. Immediately after, the EU and US preemptively published their devastating sanction plans. Yet, Putin's troops remain. The world holds its breath. By this point, World War III fear-mongering is spreading across the West. Both news outlets and influencers speculate if the world is at the brink of war. People like Tucker Carlson are especially vocal and attack Biden for his reckless foreign policy. On December 27, Ukraine holds military drills themselves. Zelensky gives several speeches in the following days, talking about Ukrainian sovereignty, pride and readiness to meet anything challenging Ukrainian security. This ultimately signals to Putin that Ukraine will fight fiercely. In our time, Putin thought that upon invasion, the Ukrainian government would collapse in a few days. There is no way he still thinks that. But Putin has already committed to the invasion with his massive troop buildup. Even with strong Western deterrence, he can't simply pull back. He needs to save face. Luckily for Putin, Western leaders also know that. In a last-ditch effort to give Putin an off-ramp, Macron brokers a deal. A 10-year freeze on NATO membership for Ukraine, a ban on Western military advisors, and the reactivation of Nord Stream 2. In return, Russia must withdraw all troops. It's a face-saving measure for both sides. In February 2022, Putin and Zelensky signed a deal in Qatar. The troops withdraw, and online, the meme "nothing ever happens" suddenly trends. But is everything fine now? With or without the Ukraine war, the world is still changing rapidly. Putin is still Putin, and now he can put Russia's resources somewhere else. But the same goes for the West. The ultimate goal of Putin, and thus Russia, was always to break the Western world order. And just because Putin got deterred from invading Ukraine doesn't mean that goal has changed. After signing the deal in Qatar, Putin travels back to Russia. Publicly, he spins the deal as a Russian victory and states that he forced the West to accept Russia's red lines. Behind the scenes, Putin still wants to weaken the West, so he pivots towards hybrid warfare, disinformation and covert influence campaigns. And thanks to the Ukraine war not happening, Russia remains stable. The country never experiences the brain drain and economic challenges it did in our time. In the West, the public and political narrative is quite different now. The successful deal with Russia is seen as favorable by most people, and trust in Western governments rises. This successful cooperation becomes a powerful advertisement for the Western world order. But debates quickly flare up about how to handle Russia from now on, particularly in Germany. The deal included Germany rejoining Nord Stream 2, but countless Germans are now suspicious against Russia. The Green Party begins mounting pressure on Scholz's government to phase away from Russian energy. Robert Habeck in particular argues that Germany cannot be energy dependent on such an unreliable country as Russia. In the US, the deal helps Biden's approval rating noticeably. Republicans don't get to accuse Biden of being the war president. Instead, the majority of Americans see him as competent on foreign policy and like how he handled the tensions with Russia. The US emerges as the big winner, maintaining its strong international image without sacrificing anything. And well, without the Ukraine war, Putin isn't the only one who can focus on other challenges. Biden can now focus on domestic issues. COVID-19 is still ongoing, and without the distraction, the White House keeps focus on vaccines, economic relief, and supply chain issues. Biden also introduces a new infrastructure bill, pouring further investments into infrastructure jobs to boost the economy. Inflation is still a problem in 2022, but without a war-driven energy shock, it's lower than in our timeline. And perhaps most crucially, gas prices don't spike, giving Biden a lot more breathing room. But the lower inflation and energy prices hit especially hard in Europe. Germany doesn't need to scramble to find energy replacements for Russian gas. Europeans don't have to prepare for high energy prices during winter, and inflation is also significantly lower. Basically, Europeans have more trust in their governments, slightly more money to spend, and thus right-wing parties rise noticeably slower. But they're still rising, mainly thanks to COVID-19 and increasing covert Russian influence. Most European countries are still divided, particularly Germany. Scholz spins Germany keeping Nord Stream 2 as a win, but the Greens rally public opinion against energy dependence on Russia. And slowly but steadily, the Greens begin winning that debate. Instead of suddenly being the party that supports sending tanks to Ukraine, they remain focused on climate change and clean energy. Their approval rises noticeably. In France, Macron uses the successful diplomacy with Russia as a campaign win, helping him defeat Le Pen in a landslide. But not all European leaders are happy. Poland, the Baltics, and especially Ukraine are angry how the West sacrificed Ukraine for stability. Zelensky's approval drops. Poland and the Baltics, meanwhile, begin pressuring NATO to give more security guarantees to Ukraine. But NATO doesn't listen. Inside Ukraine, Zelensky is seen as weak. The deal is seen as him bowing down to Putin. And now, things in Ukraine are really uncertain. Russia works hard to influence Ukrainian politics. They covertly spread anti-Zelensky and anti-Western propaganda. The Republicans, meanwhile, struggle with their messaging. During the 2022 midterms, the GOP can't accuse Biden of funding a forever war. They can only attack him on culture war and immigration issues. The GOP barely manages to flip the House, while the Democrats manage to keep a decent margin in the Senate. With no war draining attention or resources, Biden focuses aggressively on domestic issues. His post-COVID economic policies gain more traction, inflation is lower, and his approval rating stabilizes. By mid-2023, the GOP fully shifts toward culture war attacks. Especially immigration and the border are now their biggest talking points. Trump rallies still happen, but without the Ukraine disaster narrative, his attacks on Biden feel weaker. In Germany, the Greens keep pressuring Scholz to move away from Russian energy. By August 2023, Scholz reluctantly announces a gradual diversification plan. Putin, meanwhile, invests heavily in covert campaigns in Africa and the Middle East. The infamous Wagner Corps grows significantly and ramp up aggressive operations in West Africa. And that is especially troubling for France, who still has interests in the region. Pro-French governments in this timeline fall quicker, and Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger form an anti-French Sahel alliance with Wagner backing in September 2023. Global tensions are noticeably rising. Of course, not nearly as fast as in our time, but things still seem uncertain. And then, Hamas attacks Israel on October 7. In this timeline, that attack is an even bigger shock than in ours. The GOP is just in the process of finding their 2024 presidential candidate. European democracies seem stable, but with noticeable shifts. France just got kicked out of the Sahel, and now suddenly there's a war in the Middle East. The nothing ever happens crowd just got proven wrong. By October 2023, Western politicians and the public have lulled themselves into the peace by diplomacy idea. Suddenly, images of massacres and Israeli airstrikes flood the news cycle. In this alternate world, the US and Europe feel pressure to respond more decisively. Basically, they responded very decisively to the tension in Ukraine, so people expect their governments to do the same here. Biden calls the attack a day that changes the Middle East forever, but unlike in our world, where his political capital is drained by Ukraine, here he's got more leverage, which means stronger US backing for Israel. At first, Europe enters the crisis without the exhaustion of sanctions, refugee waves or energy shocks from Ukraine. That gives governments more breathing room, but it also exposes deeper divisions. The Greens in Germany, being noticeably more popular in this timeline, double down on their humanitarian, pro-Palestine stance. They openly criticize Scholz for too much alignment with Washington. This creates a real split inside the German coalition, with the SPD trying to balance Israel's security with rising pro-Palestinian protests at home. By November of 2023, public opinion is slowly shifting regarding the Israel situation. The initial shock of the conflict has worn off, and more people notice how cruel Israel's attacks truly are. Macron positions himself as the voice of restraint in Europe. Fresh off diplomatic victories with Russia, he now tries to broker a ceasefire. But Israel brushes him off, and French streets erupt with protests. The protesters demand Macron to use more pressure against Israel, but he fails to deliver. His far-right rival Marine Le Pen uses this in her favor and paints Macron as weak. But so far, the insult doesn't really stick. Even with the diplomatic failures in Israel, Macron is still riding the high of the Russia-Ukraine deal. Eastern Europe once again goes on a different route. Especially Poland and the Baltics go the other way and fully align with Israel and the US, arguing the Hamas attack proves that appeasement of terrorists or tyrants never works. The EU splits further diplomatically, with Western Europe being the cautious diplomatic side in Eastern Europe, trying to stand strong against any form of aggression. Russia meanwhile seizes the distraction. They covertly fund far-right and far-left groups inside Ukraine, aiming to fracture its democracy. The West looks away, being fully focused on the Middle East. Ukrainians feel left behind, and Ukrainian politics start to look eerily unstable, with rising calls for a strong man to replace Zelensky. The Ukrainian leadership sees itself increasingly isolated. To the west, Ukraine is a resolved issue. Russia, being more pumped with gas and oil money, also ramps up global destabilization campaigns. In Europe, Russian troll farms and media outlets flood social media platforms with anti-Israel and anti-Palestinian content simultaneously, amplifying street polarization. The Kremlin doesn't care which side people take, as long as Western societies are divided. The Israel-Palestine issue is an even bigger topic in this timeline than in ours. There are fewer distractions, and Russia pushes both sides radically. Basically, imagine the same tensions about the conflict as in our time, just even more widespread and drastic. In the US, Russian interference focuses on the 2024 election. They push anti-Biden narratives on inflation, immigration, and Gaza, while also amplifying isolationist voices in the GOP. Unlike 2016 or 2020, Moscow isn't trying to boost just Trump. They're pushing chaos, hoping for gridlock on no matter who wins. Speaking of the election, Trump secures the Republican nomination like in our time. The Democrats, of course, stick with Biden. The 2024 election looks similar like in our timeline, but it is different. Biden's stronger economy and foreign policy record give him a slight edge, but the Gaza war splits his base. After the disastrous debate in June, Biden drops out on July 19, leading to a Harris versus Trump showdown. Without the Ukraine war, Trump's peace president persona falls flat. His attacks against Harris are purely cultural and focused on the border. Also, thanks to more focus on the Gaza war, Harris positions herself more staunchly against Netanyahu, which actually helps energize her base significantly. In this altered landscape, I believe Harris would beat Trump by winning the Rust Belt, aka Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. She got a very narrow victory, but the country remains deeply divided, exactly what Putin wants. Trump immediately calls it election fraud again, and tensions in the US rise drastically. Pro-Trump protests erupt in several swing states. Some clash with counter-protesters, and throughout November and December, several pro-Trump lone wolf attacks occur. To MAGA, the election was stolen. Many Americans feel eerie and uncertain about the future, but Putin is happy. Despite Harris winning, ultimately he doesn't care who the American president is, as long as the country is divided and unstable. So far, we have avoided a lot of the dread our world is currently in. Millions of Ukrainians still live in their homes. Countless fathers can still hug their children every day. But is this world really that much better than ours? The lack of the Ukraine war doesn't just reshape geopolitics, it reshapes our psyche. The constant dread of a world sliding into World War III is gone. One war is tragic, two are a pattern. In this timeline, people don't really see a global pattern to the violence in Gaza, and the place where that change of public mentality can be observed best is actually not Ukraine or the US. That place is Germany. Just a day after the US election, the German coalition collapsed. I'm certain the Ukraine war changes nothing about that. Christian Lindner simply is too greedy. The coalition collapses as in our timeline, but what happens next is different. In this world, the public's focus has shifted to long-term issues like climate change. This benefits the Greens, who surge in the ensuing 2025 election. Their leader, Robert Habeck, a skilled populist who dominates the social media battle, narrowly edges out the CDU's Friedrich Merz to become chancellor. German mentality is completely shifted. The nation is not rearming itself under Merz, but instead is headed towards a full-scale green energy transition under Habeck. In December 2024 of our time, Assad's regime fell. Here, that doesn't happen because Russia is not distracted. So at least for Syria, the nothing ever happens meme is true. I don't want to go into too much detail about the US, because I'm planning to make a full-scale, detailed video about a Kamala Harris presidency in the near future. The tensions after the election and ever-increasing polarization are not great, but the economy is way better. The US has not turned against its allies, and American democracy remains without major threats. Inflation is lower in the US and across the West. People can afford way more. Energy prices remained largely stable. Climate change is still pressing, but being tackled. To summarize, in our timeline, if I tell my friends I have high hopes for the future, they call me crazy. In this alternate timeline, they just call me optimistic. Really, the only dreadful event still is the war in Gaza, but even that front is noticeably better compared to our time. Macron in France, Habeck in Germany and Harris in the US all oppose the war in Gaza. The trio coordinates sanctions on arms supplies to Israel and pressures Netanyahu diplomatically to accept a ceasefire. Pressure on Netanyahu's government rises quickly. By June, Netanyahu basically has no choice left. He accepts a ceasefire deal. Netanyahu is now on very thin ice, and most analysts expect that he won't survive politically into 2026. In our timeline, while I'm writing this script, there are innocent children, women and men starving in Gaza. In this alternate timeline, Palestinians now receive the aid they need. I think you can already sense how different life in this alternate 2025 is. The point of this video was to show how deeply impactful the Ukraine war truly was. The decision of one man completely changed all of our lives. Is everything fine now? Of course not. Climate change and AI are still challenges humanity has to tackle. The Gaza war has left a bitter taste in everyone's mouth, and Russia is continuing to ramp up disinformation and election interference campaigns. But it's hard to see how your life wouldn't be better in this timeline. Except if you're Canadian. If Trump hadn't threatened Canada, Peter Poilievre would have won the election. So there's at least one thing that's better in our timeline. I hope you enjoyed this glimpse into the alternate world where the Ukraine war never happened. If you did, please consider subscribing. The topic was actually chosen through a Patreon poll. If you want to take part in future monthly polls, consider joining my Patreon. A special thanks to the legends who already support me there.